and this was something that I encountered in school a lot, just believed that they could not. One orchestra called my music homework. Like, so feeling like there was this kind of unspoken supremacy around certain ways of making music.
I would love to start with a question.
Sure.
Yeah. This is picking up on a couple of threads that you've hinted at throughout your talk, and I'm wondering if you can perhaps turn up the volume on them a little bit.
Sure.
Which is connecting to this idea of like challenging some of the very conventional notions we have about like how to make music and how to make art, and it can often be this very rigid thing of like a composer writes notes on the page and performers have to fit themselves into the rough edges of exactly this very literal thing. Plenty of beautiful music has been made that way, but what you're doing is something very different. And so at CMCB, we have these 4 different student pathways, right? And one of them is performing artistry, this more conventional approach. One is about musical exploration, doing all kinds of different things, different sounds, different instruments, different genres, different styles. One is about community music making, where you're convening with other people and learning from them and building relationships with them. And the final one is citizen artistry, where you're thinking about how do you engage in social justice or in things that have meaning in your life, whether that be very explicitly through things like public art or collaborations with healthcare, or whether that be in more subtle ways. And one of the reasons I think your work is so interesting is because it touches on all 4 of those pathways. And especially for people who are here who are maybe not musicians, who don't have all of the full context of like the waters you're swimming in. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more explicitly about like how your work touches on all those things and some of the subtle ways in which you're really inviting people to be their full selves in a space that often really encourages them to diminish themselves and make their own personality as small as possible.
Totally. So yeah, so something I didn't really touch on, and you're right. I think in some ways it's always interesting. Each presentation kind of foregrounds certain elements and not. Like my parents are both community organizers, and I grew up in spaces where there was a lot of encouragement of kind of facilitating questions and facilitating investigation that would happen on the part of the community, that then there was this way in which you could kind of help people ask the question of the problem that they were having, and then have them kind of give them the tools to research and develop their own answers to that, instead of kind of giving those answers. And of course, you know, for any of us who have read like all Freire, you know, this kind of concept of a banking model of education versus one that's kind of giving, you know, this is where popular education, I think even the term comes from, but giving a kind of opportunity for people to grow themselves, to me is an extremely musical endeavor. And, you know, music was a pretty core part of that childhood in that way. And so I guess for me, the way that I'm approaching all of this is really trying to kind of respond to the problems I see, I guess, like respond to like the kind of, you know, clots that I see, and like either people's ability to voice themselves, you know, if you feel like they can creatively engage or engage with improvisation. I think, like, for example, classical musicians, and this was something that I encountered in school a lot, just believed that they could not. Like there was like some notion that they had learned at some point that it was like not what it was not theirs, or it wasn't something that they had a relationship with, not something that they could have a relationship with, or alternatively something that was like dirty or like not ideal or something. And so I think a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is kind of like trick people into developing those parts of their voice in a way that isn't kind of in some ways confrontation happens, and it has happened before, especially in larger ensemble contexts. Like I've had 4 reviews from orchestras. one orchestra called my music homework. Like, so, I think in some ways there is this kind of way in which people feel that push and pull, and a way of kind of when you leave holes, when you only give suggestion, when you hint at what you want, you can either decide to ask a question or you can decide not to ask a question. And fortunately and unfortunately, my music requires them to do the first thing. And so sometimes the music doesn't work. Sometimes people are unwilling to go, and for music that, especially like if you've seen from some of these scores, has fairly basic material that is kind of the building blocks of the music. Sometimes it only exists in that material, and then it just kind of never develops, it never transforms, it never grows past itself, which I think is something that we can collectively do together. When I think that there's this kind of step up, step back feeling that the music has, that I think that when we are engaging sound instead of words, I think that I have found a great deal of freedom there in being able to voice things about yourself or about the situation or about the context that perhaps you couldn't otherwise. Just for one quick example, I think in the little teaser trailer we saw, there's this moment that we were able to capture in it, which is one of the players kind of had a quietness about her, throughout the rehearsal process, and we were kind of constantly just trying to push a little bit, you can really rip into this, you really let go. And I think in some ways there's this magic that happens with performance when you're on stage in front of other people, where suddenly some of that anxiety it has to go away, or you're just frozen and you can't do anything. And so I think there's this there's this kind of alchemy thing that happens in that. And during the performance, there were multiple times where we thought it was a transition point, and we had a series of those set out, and then suddenly she would just rip into a solo, and it would just overwhelm and beautifully bloom past past what it felt like the kind of ensemble shape that was happening. And so there was this, I felt like those were the moments where I felt most proud and most musically satisfied. But it's musically satisfied and kind of person satisfied, I think are really close in my practice.
I see in the chat we have something from Coral. Coral, please feel free to interrupt me and unmute yourself if you'd like to speak as well. I don't want to have to speak on your behalf if you have more you'd like to share, but I know you put some great stuff in the chat. Coral said, I love Procreate. I've been in there so much lately. I see textures and music for transitions that remind me of your descriptions for music. With having a Procreate brush, everything you draw contains little hyperbolic infinities stored more succinctly digitally in little formulas, polygons, and vectors. These little infinite hyperboles are personally how I view crescendos and gestures that one might think of as musical. With your specificity and simultaneously your aleatoric openness, what does working with gesture or texture mean to you? Does it mean to you, do those set of limitations allow you to escape the baggage of classical music? Is that important to you? There's more, but I'll stop there for now.
Totally. I think I might use the relationship with classical music as a way to answer a little bit of the texture gesture question. I think there's a few answers. I think one of the answers that I came to that really transitioned how I was thinking about composing was that it's really hard to not make music in certain ways. And I think for a long time in school, I was determined that I wouldn't do certain things. And I kept denying myself things that ultimately were responses to either the way that I was being taught them, ways that I felt like they were being, that there was a cultural hierarchy that was emphasizing them, and I was just not feeling it. And then in some ways also feeling like there was this kind of unspoken supremacy around certain ways of making music, and that like classical music was like the source of those evils. And I think in some ways like that is like still a legitimate, that's like, yes, and and it's a very like step one. And I think after that comes a kind of like, well, what is your relationship with it? Or what is the relationship of your mentors with it, or your teachers? And in that way, like, what can you choose? Like, can you choose like this thing and not that thing? And I think that we are able to do that. And so for like things like, for example, texture and gesture, I think I had a video posted like 2 days ago of a piece. And in that piece, I like don't shy away from like Bach things. Like, I love like the solo, the sonatas and partitas. And so like, but there was like a Bach account, and it put the time codes of like the Bach references or something. And I was like, okay, that's like really cool, I guess. But also like, okay, like, and so I think in some ways, like, I have definitely chosen to focus, basically before 1600 and after like 1915 or something, as like what I consider music that I'm interested in, quoting or integrating or like engaging. And that's just, kind of in some ways wanting to shy away from, elements of a kind of like climaxing romanticism, and towards something that's a little bit more open, where moment to moment things can pop out and create, beautiful things. But how that relates to a kind of to classical music, and I'm using classical music to describe like way too much. Like it's also like not a great term. But anyway, to get to the other part of the question, which is basically like how does notation encounter these things? I guess I always think of the kind of memory of each instrument and how people have relationships with their instruments, and how you can kind of start to create a relationship where they can be a conduit for that part of themselves. And sometimes that can be like a picture or a word or, like I think sometimes like you might have like a single pitch and you might say haunting or something, and someone's like, haunting, okay, that's a harmonic, okay, and that's one way. Or another way is like, this is like super breathy with a kind of like, with like growl in the throat. I don't know, I think I'm just looking at Zach's, I'm just thinking about flutes, but but that there are lots of like ways in which you can kind of access the musical knowledge of each performer, and that's a way that you can start to humanize them, in a relationship where you often are sent, or the power is is utterly with you, for a reason that still hasn't been explained to me, but it's been taught to me. So in some ways, I think when we recognize that power relationship exists, then we're able to sometimes recognize that actually, if we want to shift that relationship and shift that power dynamic, it's not about like Machiavellian knowing better than you, like classical music's bad, you should hate it, like rather than like, oh, hey, here are all these like, here's all this stuff that you spent 20 years learning. What if it feels musically like part of you, and what if it doesn't? And maybe we can like leave those things that feel not musically part of you behind, and really focus on and let flourish those other things. And when we get to do that in space together, then those things start to mutually affect one another. And then suddenly we create a vocabulary that's like full of like the things that we like. And then